Hello, and welcome to the 2024 National Wilderness Skills Institute from Gunnison, Colorado. My name is Jim Lovelace. I'm the Supervisory Outdoor Recreation Planner for the Bureau of Land Management Gunnison Field Office. Here in the Gunnison Valley, we are fortunate to be surrounded on all sides by wilderness areas. Like many of you have or will be, I've spent the last 20 years of my career in federal service managing wilderness, either by patrolling, clearing trails, or analyzing minimum requirements for project work. The field side of our profession relies on a solid base of academic scholarship and understanding of the principles of the Wilderness Act. We're lucky to be joined today by a fellow resident of the Gunnison Valley who just so happens to have authored one of the foundational texts of environmental history, Wilderness and the American Mind. I am proud to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Roderick Nash.
Good morning, I'm Roderick Nash. I'm very happy to be the keynoter to the Wilderness Skills program. I'm used to talking live to thousands, tens of thousands of students as a professor at the University of California. And here I have an audience of one, my lovely wife, Honeydew, and Jim Lovelace. But I hope we can have a laugh or two, and I hope I can leave you with some energy, some energetic ideas for the next couple of days. I think the first thing to say is this is a symbiosis between academicians and field-oriented people. And you might ask, why should I pay any attention to an academician, a professor, went to Harvard, taught at the University of California? What can this guy tell me about wilderness skills? So I thought I'd spend just a little time kind of creating my case for knowing something about the wilderness as a participant, a user, as well as a scholar. I'm going to show you a book right now on the screen. Let's see if that'll come up. You should be seeing it as The Big Drops, 10 Legendary Rapids of the American West. And that's a book that I wrote in 1978 when I realized that I was one of the perhaps the only person in the world who would run all 10 of the major rapids that I talked about in this book. I'd started out in the 1950s summer job as a guide on the Snake River, Jackson Hole, running boats. I started in the Grand Canyon in the 1960s, working for oars, working for Grand Canyon dories, dories being a double-ended type of boat, hard boat, not an inflatable, rowing for the legendary Martin Lytton. I was there in 1983 when we had 100,000 CFS and led a trip, one of the few trips through in that June of 1983 flood. And I have spent probably 4 years of my life below the rim in Grand Canyon. We have this sort of slogan among river guys, girls, that the time you spend below the rim is not counted against your allotted time on Earth. So when Peter comes and calls, you might say, well, what about those 4 years? Oh yeah, okay, that's a little extra. We won't come back for 4 more years. Hoping that's true. So I have spent a lot of time in wild country, 4 years below the rim in Grand Canyon, as I say. And I have seen river running go from an exploratory sort of adventure sport to a mass public sport. And that's something that's going to bear heavily on some of your work. For example, let's just take a example. In 1957, 80 people ran Colorado River through Grand Canyon, 1957. And today, over 30,000 people a year run it. There obviously had to be some controls, some permitting. And in 1972, the first permits came to the Grand Canyon. The waiting line eventually grew to 20 years long. Now it's a lottery system. For prime dates in the Grand Canyon, you, if you're lucky, might get one, but chances are you might wait a very long time for one. Wilderness is an activity that many people can't do together. It's kind of like tennis, you know? 2 or 4 people play. If you have 18 on a side, it's not the same game. So carrying capacity management, restricting numbers became a thing. The first permits for entry into wilderness were in the Grand Canyon in 1972, and also on Mount Whitney, 1972, Forest Service administration there. Both places were in danger, and I had argued this in some of my writing, of being loved to death. So first it was show and go, later it became permitted. Grand Canyon, Mount Whitney, the first in public land management to have quotas based upon carrying capacity. The second book I'm going to show you is Wilderness and the American Mind. That picture, some of you might recognize, is of the Grand Teton National Park, is of the Grand Tetons, Mount Moran. And it was here, as I said, in 1957 that I began river running. And that book is now almost 50 years old. It's been in print continually, it's 5th edition. It's a good book, but I think it's fair to say it's also a very lucky book. I finished my PhD thesis, University of Wisconsin, 1964. That was, of course, the same year as the passage of the Wilderness Act. So I was, in effect, on the curve, on the wave of interest in wild country. I wrote some of the first articles about Aldo Leopold, who figured in Forest Service wilderness policy and later in wilderness philosophy at the University of Wisconsin. I was standing on the shoulders of people like Rachel Carson and other environmentalists, but I was probably, some argue, the first environmental historian to try to write about human relationships to the natural world. Now, this book, Wilderness and the American Mind, is a story about a revolution. It's a revolution in attitude toward wild country. A revolution from hatred, panic, fear, to appreciation, worship, love, appreciation, and excitement. The reasons for that change is the subject of the book. And it's an ongoing revolution. There's still pockets of people who have no place for wild country or for wild creatures. But for the most part, we've become civilized enough to appreciate wilderness. It's very hard to argue wilderness in a frontier context, as Americans found out. The last thing John Winthrop wanted to do when he stepped off the Mayflower in 1620 was create a wilderness reserve or a national park. And the fact that we have a wilderness system now and legislated preservation speaks to this revolution that I try to talk about. The Outside Magazine said that Wilderness and the American Mind, the book, changed our world. But I would say the world was ready to be changed. I was fortunate to be there at the time and to write a book that helped facilitate that change. I want us to start out by saying that let's define wilderness. This is something that the skill session is about. It's something you'll be dealing with every day in your careers. First thing I'm going to say to you is that wilderness is not a thing. It's not a thing like a mountain or a lake where everybody could go and say, that's a mountain. All right, yeah, that's a mountain. I agree, that's a mountain. But as far as wilderness goes, for people to say that's a wilderness, it depends very much on their background. Jim Lovelace and I were talking earlier this week about his mother walking down a path in Florida, suddenly kind of veered away from the road. Maybe there was a tropical bird flying, and she said to Jim, her son, now I see why you love the wilderness. The proper response to that is not to say, no, this isn't a wilderness, Mom. It's to say, thank you. It's to say, okay, for you, it is a wilderness. So this is maybe about the most important thing I'm saying today is wilderness is a perceived reality. It's a state of mind. It's not so much a geographical feature, it's a state of mind. It varies person to person. And that's one reason why, even though we have designated capital W wilderness, we have wild qualities that far transcend, far outside of those designated wildernesses. And we have to be respectful of them and of people who go there and say and feel that they are in a wilderness. So that is where your role as a manager and a skills person comes in. It's a very delicate feeling, wilderness as a state of mind. Let's talk about the word itself. It ends in ness, N-E-S-S, right? And other words that end in ness, you can see, are also subjective, also individual. Take, for example, the word happiness, or the word kindness, or the word greatness. They will differ. What one is one person's happiness may not be that of the next. So right away you see that there is a subjectivity, as we would call it, a personalization of feeling about wilderness. Now, how about the will part? Will is an interesting word in the English language. We have words like free will. We have words like willpower. We have words like imposing one's will. I've heard football coaches say, we've got to impose our will on the other team, impose our will on this other team. Let's talk horses for a minute. Howard Sonnheiser, who wrote the Wilderness Act 1964, used the word untrammeled as part of his definition of wilderness. A trammel is a hobble. It's like a net, and often was used to restrain horses. So let's kind of follow along with Howard Sonnheiser, someone I knew actually, and talk about what happens when you break a horse. That's what cowboys call it in our country, right, Jim? Breaking a horse. Gunnison does that all the time. What you do in breaking a horse is you substitute your will for its will. There are wild horses, you know, that range around in the American West. But there are also horses that, through hobbles and bits and halters and ropes and corrals and fences, are never free. They're totally controlled. The human will has been substituted for the will of the horses. So that's a pretty good example of breaking the will and the concept of will. Will being what a wild horse is. So it's all about control, and it's all about freedom. The word wild is really a contraction of the word will. Willed, with two L's, W-I-L-L-E-D, willed, contracts to wild. So if you are willed, if you have your own free will, you're wild. If you're controlled, then you're domesticated or you're not wild. We use the term all the time. Baseball pitchers who can't throw strikes are said to be wild. They're said to be wild. And wilderness really means self-willed land. Okay, that's something to write down if you're writing. Self-willed land. And that has enormous importance for you as potential managers and field personnel. I'll come right out and say it, that in my opinion, the best management is the least management, the lightest touch. And you learn something about that from people coming in this course. Howard Sonnheiser, who wrote the Wilderness Act, many years in legislation, many years being considered rewritten. But Sonnheiser of the Wilderness Society was the author. And he said in a famous phrase in another article that when it came to wilderness, you should be guardians and not gardeners. That's another thing to jot down. Guardians and not gardeners. As guardians, you allow self-willed land to be wild and to be wilderness, to be perceived as wilderness, as guardians. As gardeners, you weed, you plant, you bring in species, you put hobbles on horses, you trammel horses. But if you're a guardian, you have the courage to allow change to occur. And you have courage to, in some cases, do nothing. That brings us, of course, to a lake here in Colorado called Trappers Lake that one of the great figures in Forest Service wilderness, Arthur Carhart, worked at as a young man. Carhart was given a summer job on this lake, wild lake, that most people would perceive as wild lake. And his superior said, Arthur, I want you to go out and lay out a road around this lake this summer and create lots for houses, summer houses. That's going to be part of our mission. This is on public land, on Forest Service land. So the summer went by. At the end of the summer, they called Arthur Carhart in. This was about 1921, and they said, where's your plan? And Arthur had a blank piece of paper in front of him. And he said, sir, my plan is to have no plan. He said, I walked around the lake 5 or 6 times. I looked at potential house sites, and I came back and I thought, we shouldn't do anything to this lake. We shouldn't build houses on this lake. We should have no control over this lake. We should let it be self-willed or wild. And the supervisor agreed with him, said, okay. So here was a guy for whom less was more, and whose mantra might be the best management is the least management. Arthur Carhart, C-A-R-H-A-R-T, Trappers Lake, Colorado. I'm going to show you another book I wrote, Wilderness in the American Mind. This one is called, you see that? The Rights of Nature, A History of Environmental Ethics. And I'm going to argue to you that the frontier for wilderness appreciation, protection, preservation, justification is going to be ethical increasingly, and not so much as it's been in the past, anthropocentric values, even those that I enjoy, such as recreation, such as scenery, such as economic gains to communities that happen to have wilderness near them. What Sonnheiser said in the Wilderness Act is that its intention was to give the American people an enduring resource of wilderness. I wish he had added I wish he had added, the purpose of the Wilderness Act is also to create a homeland for wild species. We talk about homeland a lot right now in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian war. What is a homeland? Where can a species live? The anthropocentric argument has taken wilderness a long way. Recreation. Jim Lovelace manages a hugely important recreational resource in near Gunnison for mountain biking. But the future, I think, for wildland may have nothing to do or little to do with people. It may have little or nothing to do with what we would call scenic beauty. What it has to do with is wildness. And that has implications for forest fire control. It has implications for allowing places to be self-willed. It's a new rationale for wilderness. It suggests that it is not about us as much as we think. The 64 Act said, for the American people, an enduring resource of wilderness. I say, what about the elk people? What about the moose people? What about the salmon people? What about the blue-green algae people? They too, I think, benefit from wilderness. And managers of wilderness need to recognize, this is important, that their clientele increasingly in the future may not just be human. Their clientele may also be biocentric. And a biocentric rationale for wilderness may emerge. Sennheiser does say something kind of interesting in the Wilderness Act. The quote is, this is 1964, the quote is that man, he should have said people, but he said man, it was 1960s. Man is a visitor who does not remain. Let's think about that phrase for a minute. Man is a visitor who does not remain. The implication there is that this is someone else's home. And that to me is the beginning of a biocentric perspective about wilderness. It's a follow-up of Aldo Leopold's concepts of the land ethic. Now, you've all had rules on visiting someone else's home. We've all had these rules. 8 years old, you've been invited to a sleepover, okay? And your mom probably told you, okay, you're going to go on this sleepover, but there's some things you've got to remember when you do this sleepover. Don't raid the refrigerator. Don't break things. Hang up your towels. Flush the toilet. Don't hog the TV remote. Don't disrespect the pets that these people may have. And don't steal. And when you leave, your mom, I'm sure reminded you, you say thank you. Man is a visitor who does not remain. You've had a sleepover in somebody else's house when you go to wilderness. It's where the wild things are, where the wild things live. How are we doing on time, Jim? Good. I wanted to leave you with some thoughts, some takeaway ideas. It's hard not to be a gardener. People are proud of being gardeners. They look at a project and they say, look, we can improve this. We can make the crooked straight and the rough places plain. The words of the Old Testament. But there are other people who say, let it be crooked. It doesn't have to be plain. The trails in Hartman Rocks are not leveled out. They're hard trails. That's the beginning of accepting the concept of wilderness. It's hard to relinquish control, which is what wilderness means, restrain control. It's hard to relinquish control to evolution. There is change. The idea in wilderness is to accept the change, not to fight the change. Gardeners fight the change. Pro-wilderness people accept change. They asked me some years ago, a couple of years ago, if they should transport wolves into Isle Royale National Park in Lake Michigan because the moose population was exploding and the ice that used to support the wolves crossing from the mainland was no longer thick enough to do that. I told him, this isn't a zoo. This isn't a botanic garden. It's a wilderness. And Isle Royale is a definite W wilderness. Capital W wilderness means it's part of the Wilderness Act. And controversy ensued over that. But I tried to get them to say, look, it may be change, and it may be change that you don't like. What do you do then? How do you restrain yourself? Something you don't like, something you don't think the American public will like. But with wilderness designation or to preserve wild character, one has to accept the fact that people will not like some parts of that. Don't be afraid of change. Doing nothing is doing something. Another thing to write down. Doing nothing is doing something. People have a tendency to feel doing nothing is doing nothing. Arthur Carhart. Doing nothing. Let's not build the road around the lake and the cabins. Doing nothing is doing something. Take that idea along with you. Wilderness as a concept, an idea, and remember that's what it is, a state of mind rather than a geographical feature. Wilderness is a place, a chance, concept where we learn gratitude, humility, and dependence and dependency. It's a place where we learn restraint. It's where we put our species' needs and wants into balance with those of the rest of the natural world. Even if we never visited them, wilderness areas have value as symbols of unselfishness. Good concept, symbols of unselfishness. They are gestures of planetary modesty on the part of the Earth's most dangerous animal. That would be us. Planetary modesty on the part of the Earth's most dangerous animal. A nation that creates and maintains protected wilderness is showing capability of a kinder, a gentler, more sustainable relationship with this planet. Wilderness means that we can share better than we have in the past this planet. Seems to me this is ultimately important. And finally, a personals ad. I don't know whether we still have those online, but I guess they call them speed dating now. But a personals ad for the Earth. I've got one for the Earth. Put it in the back of the paper. And it goes like this. Temperate but endangered planet enjoys weather, photosynthesis, evolution, seeks a caring relationship with intelligent life form. Hey, maybe it could be us. Maybe it still could be us after all is said and done. All 8-9 billion of us. Wilderness might be one of the pathways that lead us to responding to that personnel ad. So yeah, we can have a caring relationship with the planet. So as a visitor to your home, in Sennheiser's words. Thank you for allowing an academician. Thank you for allowing a professor to talk to you people in the field. And good luck to you in your career and your work this summer. Hope a few of the things that I said today will resonate with you, that you'll take them away, think about them, and think how truly remarkable and revolutionary wilderness appreciation is. And you'll think about how delicate wilderness is. Thank you very much.
Dr. Nash, I was hoping that you might be able to answer a question for us. My question for you is, what have you seen across the arc or the span of your career that has either improved wilderness or detracted from wilderness in the United States? This could be wins on wilderness designations, legislation, studies being conducted, etc.
Good question, Jim. The thing that I've seen that really takes the most courage, I think, from the public lands administrator is to limit, restrain some kinds of human use in wilderness. Out here in Colorado, you and I know we have an ongoing clash between mountain bikers and wilderness. It takes courage to say no mountain bikes. It's a machine. You could not supposed to use the machine in wilderness. There are a lot of mountain bikers who would love to ride trails in wilderness. It takes a strong, courageous public land presence to say, nope, that isn't consistent with the Wilderness Act. So I've seen that, and I sort of applauded that as a factor. And also, as I mentioned before in the talk, Jim, the carrying capacity idea, beginning with the Grand Canyon in 1972 and Mount Whitney in 1972 as well. To have the courage, again, as a public lands officer, to say, we are only going to allow 15 people down the river today, or we're going to allow 3 trips to start down the river, or we're only going to allow 35 people to climb Mount Whitney on a 2-day trip starting today. You've got to apply for that permit, get that permit. That takes courage. Instead of opening it up wide, it takes courage and it takes respect for the wilderness as a delicate and easily damaged state of mind. Many people can't enjoy solitude together. Too many people can spoil a wilderness. The wilderness, remember, as I've been saying, is not about those many people. The wilderness should be about non-human species. There are we think, over 8 million of them on the planet, non-human species. Some of them are reliant upon wilderness, depend upon wilderness, like the sage grouse. And you've shut down trails to protect sage grouse habitat. That isn't wilderness, but it is a wild species, as I was saying. Recognize that wildness transcends just capital W wilderness, but can be out there. Those are encouraging things that I've noticed. Was that responsive to the question?
Yes, it was. It was. I'm curious, are there any things that kind of jump to your mind in terms of wins on wilderness designations or legislation or studies being conducted, things like that?
Well, the biggest win, and I'm a historian, remember, so I probably think a little further back than some of the people who wrote those questions. But the biggest win for wilderness was in Alaska. The idea of having a huge amount of wild country there, having a native interest that had to be taken into consideration there too, and to have President Carter pass the national monument status that saved things for a while, and then the Alaskan National Interest Lands Act, I wrote about in the book, Wilderness of the American Mind, tell the whole story of Alaska, which was almost like finding a new planet floating around in space with a lot of wildness on it, and a big challenge to public land managers. How are we going to manage this place with respect to the wild things that live there, with respect to the native people who live there? What sorts of things are we going to allow? What kind of road access are we going to allow, if any? That to me was a huge win. We will never again on this planet have a chance to do something similar. There are no more Alaskas. And we had our chance. And fortunately, the sort of decision-making of Alaska came after the Wilderness Act was in place. Wilderness Act 1964, some of the Alaskan acts into the 1980s. And even though we still have people tugging at the sleeve of public land officials saying, let us drill oil. Let us drill some oil up there. We have a very strong public presence that says, no, let's call this a wilderness. A lot of people perceive this as a wilderness and perceive the wilderness ecosystem with its elk, with its caribou, I mean to say, as extremely important. Was that responsive?
It sure was. It sure was. My final question for you, Dr. Nash. Do you have a favorite place in wilderness that jumps to your mind as a place that had a maybe a special experience or a specific resonance for you?
Well, it's hard for somebody who spent 70 trips in the Grand Canyon to pull away from the canyon.
I thought
you really have to think about that. And there's one special place in the canyon that not everybody goes to. And sure, there are a few parties floating down, but really when you push off from Lee's Ferry, you're going for 2 weeks. And what you have on your boats is what you've got. There's no 7-Eleven to restock and resupply. So as you go down the river, you increasingly feel, I'm in one of the great wildernesses of the world. There may be a few other people coming down, but their numbers, remember, since 1972, have been controlled. So there are not that many coming down. Sometimes they just go by you. And sometimes the trip leaders get together and they work out. Wouldn't it be nice if you could visit a place, we'll hang back, and then once you move on downstream, our group will come in. We're talking about a place a mile deep. We're not talking about a single car for 225 miles. We're not talking about a single building for 270 miles. Now, there's one place in there. I'll give it away. I'll share it. It's called Christmas Tree Cave. And it's a little hard to get to. You've got to pull your boats, tie them up. If they're hard boats like dories, they're kind of banging around a little bit on the rocks. You've got to tie them up. Then you've got to climb rocks, go across some sort of mossy, wet stuff that's slippery, climb rocks, eventually get into a magnificent dome-like cave. I usually, when I'm guiding down there, tell people to put on a face mask or tie a bandana around their face because there's a lot of guano in that dust from bats and so forth. And as you walk, you tend to stir it up. So we try to walk carefully and lightly, not stir up too much guano. It's magnificent to be in the shade and look back at the sun on the river. But the real special thing is still to come. As you walk to the back of the cave, there's a small peephole that you can look through, a little crack in the rocks. And in behind it is a small room. And in that room, there is a Christmas tree. It's white, like it was flocked. But it was caused by the dripping of stalactites from the ceiling over thousands and thousands of years. And it's formed a little tree. like you'd put on your table in the dining room, about 2 feet tall, with all the branches spread out, delicate. No wind ever gets there. No weather ever gets there. A lot of people don't even know it's there. They might go into the cave and not even know to look through the little crack. But there's the Christmas tree, and with the magic of cell phones, you can illuminate it. I used to have to take a flashlight, but now you can take a cell phone picture of it, of the Christmas tree and Christmas tree cave. To me, that's a special place. And I will sometimes just sit there for several hours and let the river flow by, look at the river, and think about how extraordinarily lucky we are to have a place like this, protected place like this in our country.
And that's what wilderness is all about. Dr. Nash, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And that was wonderful. I appreciate that.
It's a pleasure, Jeb. I wish the trainees the very best of the season ahead.